The Unconsulted Self. Kierkegaard on the Anxiety of Existence. I stick my finger in existence. It smells of nothing. Where am I? Who am I? How came I here? What is this thing called the world? What does this world mean? Who is it that has lured me into the world? Why was I not consulted? Why not made acquainted with its manners and customs instead of throwing me into the ranks, as if I had been bought by a kidnapper, a dealer in souls? How did I obtain an interest in this big enterprise they call reality? Why should I have an interest in it? Is it not a voluntary concern? And if I am to be compelled to take part in it, where is the director? I should like to make a remark to him. Is there no director? Whither shall I turn with my complaint? In these piercing lines, drawn from Søren Kierkegaard's Either/or 1843, and echoed in his journals, the Danish philosopher captures the profound vertigo that defines modern human existence. At first glance, the questions appear disarmingly simple, almost naive, like those a bewildered child might pose upon waking in an unfamiliar room. Yet their cumulative power is nothing short of devastating. They expose a self that has been thrust into existence without invitation, a self that must navigate a stage for which no rehearsal was offered and no script provided. We arrive after the fact, handed a role in a drama whose author remains elusive, if not entirely absent. This essay expands upon the central themes of the passage: the metaphysical scandal of non-consultation, the desperate search for an unseen director, the paradoxical constitution of the self as a dynamic relation rather than a fixed essence, and the way profound lostness becomes the fertile ground for authentic selfhood. Drawing deeply from Kierkegaard's pseudonymous works, such as The Concept of Anxiety, The Sickness unto Death, Fear and Trembling, and Stages on Life's Way, we will explore how these motifs interweave to form his diagnosis of the human condition in an age of increasing abstraction, crowd conformity, and spiritual evasion. 1. The Unconsulted Arrival. Existence before consent and the birth of angst. The emotional and philosophical heart of the passage lies in that final, indignant cry. Why was I not consulted? Kierkegaard is not seeking a scientific or biological account of conception and birth. He is confronting a deeper metaphysical outrage. Human beings exist prior to any possibility of consent. No prenatal contract was signed. No one inquired, would you consent to inhabit this particular body, this family lineage, this historical epoch with its peculiar customs, limitations, and absurdities? The self does not begin as a voluntary project we undertake with full awareness. It is imposed like an unchosen sentence, one we are then expected to embrace and perform as though it were freely selected. This lack of consultation generates what Kierkegaard famously terms angst, often translated as dread or anxiety. In The Concept of Anxiety, 1844, he distinguishes angst sharply from ordinary fear. Fear has a definite object, a threat we can identify and potentially avoid, such as a predator or a looming deadline. Angst, by contrast, is objectless. It arises from the dizzying awareness of freedom in the face of groundlessness. Standing at the edge of possibility, we sense that nothing but our own choice prevents us from leaping, or, more accurately, from choosing at all. The unconsulted arrival means we are forever catching up to a self we did not authorize. We inherit a how, a concrete finite situation, our genetics, upbringing, cultural milieu, and must somehow forge a who atop it. Kierkegaard illustrates this through the biblical figure of Adam in the Garden of Eden. Before the fall, Adam exists in a state of innocence, but innocence is not ignorance, it is a dreaming spirit. The prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge awakens possibility. You shall surely die. This command does not terrify through specific threat, but through the infinite openness it reveals. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, the psychological correlate of standing before an abyss of choices with no external guarantee. In our own lives, this manifests as the quiet or not so quiet panic that accompanies major life decisions, career, relationships, faith, where we realize the ground beneath us is of our own making, yet we never chose the terrain. The scandal deepens when we consider the historical and social dimensions. We are thrown not only into a body, but into a particular time and place, 19th century Copenhagen for Kierkegaard, or our own era of digital distraction, political polarization, and technological acceleration. Why this era, with its specific illusions of progress and its hidden nihilism? Why these parents, this socio-economic starting point, these inherited neuroses? The absence of consultation renders every claim to self-mastery suspect. We pretend autonomy while building upon unchosen foundations. This produces a perpetual sense of belatedness. Existence precedes essence, as later existentialists would echo, but Kierkegaard insists the gap between them is traversed only through passionate, repeated choice amid anxiety. 2. Where is the director? The demand for authority and the stages of existence. A variant of the quote heightens the indignation. And if I am compelled to take part in it, where is the director? I want to see him. If life is a theatrical performance, and Kierkegaard frequently employs dramatic metaphors, then the absence of a visible director transforms the stage into either meaningless chaos or a sadistic experiment. The props feel oppressively real, our bodies, our relationships, our obligations. Yet the lines are improvised, the blocking unclear, and any applause or jeers from an unseen audience arrive too faintly to offer reliable guidance. Kierkegaard, writing in a Denmark that was officially Christian but increasingly complacent and Christendom-oriented, does not simply question God's existence in a modern atheistic sense. He questions God's intelligible presence in the texture of daily life. The director remains offstage, silent, invisible. This hiddenness fuels the engine of his thought, the famous leap of faith. Faith, for Kierkegaard, is never intellectual certainty or probabilistic calculation. It is a passionate decision to live as though the director exists and cares, despite the lack of empirical evidence or rational proof. It is subjectivity at its highest intensity. Truth is subjectivity, where objective uncertainty is embraced with infinite personal commitment. To understand this fully, we must examine Kierkegaard's 3 stages, or spheres of existence, which provide the framework for responding to the unconsulted condition. These are not automatic developmental phases like childhood to adulthood, but qualitative modes of being that one may inhabit, transition between, or remain stuck within. In the aesthetic stage, life is governed by the pursuit of immediacy, pleasure, and novelty. The aesthete, exemplified in either Slash or by the young seducer or the reflective diarist, seeks to banish boredom, the root of all evil. Rotation of crops, constantly changing amusements, relationships, or roles becomes a strategy for sustaining interest. Yet this stage ultimately collapses under its own weight. Pleasure leads to satiety. Reflection dissolves action into endless irony. The unconsulted self here evades responsibility by treating existence as a spectacle to be consumed rather than a task to be enacted. Without a director, one simply improvises for momentary effect, but the performance grows hollow. The ethical stage marks a higher plane. Here, the individual chooses commitment, duty, and universal moral norms. Marriage, vocation, and civic responsibility replace fleeting seduction. One becomes a self by subordinating inclination to obligation, as Judge William urges in either Slash or. Yet even the ethical remains insufficient. It relies on humanly constructed universals, Hegelian Sittlichkeit, or social morality, which cannot ultimately justify the individual's unique, absurd existence before the absolute. The ethical person still operates within immanence, assuming a rational order where choices align with general principles. But the director's silence exposes the limits. What if universal ethics demands the sacrifice of the particular, as in Abraham's command to sacrifice Isaac? Only the religious stage confronts the paradox head-on. Here, the individual relates absolutely to the absolute, God, and relatively to the relative, the world. Faith involves a teleological suspension of the ethical, a leap beyond rational universals into the absurd, where the single individual stands higher than the universal. Abraham becomes the knight of faith, willing to sacrifice his son not out of ethical calculation, but in passionate obedience to a God who defies human categories. The leap is not from irrationality to certainty, but from the safety of crowd-mediated meaning into the terrifying freedom of personal responsibility before the hidden director. It is lived in fear and trembling, with constant repetition, because faith must be renewed daily amid anxiety. The demand for the director thus propels one through the stages. Without acknowledging the need for a transcendent relation, one remains trapped in despair disguised as normalcy. 3. The self as a relation that relates itself to itself, synthesis, despair, and the task of becoming. Kierkegaard's most technical formulation of the self appears in The Sickness unto Death, 1849, written under the pseudonym Anticlimacus. The self is a relation that relates itself to itself, or is the relations relating itself to itself in the relation. This dense sentence is not mere wordplay. It illuminates the original passage's bewilderment. A stone is simply itself, a finished product of necessity. An animal lives out its instincts without self-reflection. But a human being is a synthesis of opposites, the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal, necessity, what we are given, body, history, limitations, and possibility, what we might become through freedom. Considered merely as a synthesis, a human is not yet a self. The relation between body and soul, or finite and infinite, is a negative unity, a third term that holds the poles together without dynamic tension. But when the relation relates itself to itself, this becomes the positive third, which is the self. The self is not a static substance, but an ongoing activity, a continual process of self-reflection, self-choice, and self-constitution. In relating to itself, the self simultaneously relates to the power that established it, God. Despair arises precisely when this relation is disordered, when one refuses to be the self one is meant to become, either by wanting to be rid of oneself, despair of weakness, or by defiantly willing to be a self without reference to the establishing power, despair of defiance. This returns us to the unconsulted arrival. Because we were not consulted, the synthesis feels imposed and unstable. Anxiety reveals the gap between our actual, finite situation and our infinite potential. Most people flee this by losing themselves in the crowd, which Kierkegaard declares untruth. The crowd offers ready-made identities. I am a professional, a citizen, a family member, that dull the need for self-relation. Authenticity demands confronting the dizziness. Each, who am I, is not passive discovery, but an active relating. We become selves through passionate repetition of choice, willing to be the particular self God intends amid uncertainty. Despair, then, is the sickness unto death, not physical death, but the eternal dying of failing to become spirit. Even apparent success in the world can mask it. The outwardly accomplished person who has forgotten the task of selfhood lives in the most insidious form of despair, unnoticed because it aligns perfectly with social expectations. 4. Lostness as the beginning of authenticity, the crowd, despair, and the leap into individual existence. Kierkegaard insists that genuine life begins with the honest admission of being lost. This is not clinical depression or mere melancholy, but a clarifying wakefulness. In the aesthetic stage, one distracts from lostness through endless novelty. In the ethical, one domesticates it through duty. But when ready-made answers crumble, when the crowd's consolations fail, one stands naked before the questions, where am I? Why was I not consulted? The crowd, for Kierkegaard, levels existence. It dissolves the single individual into abstraction, making truth a matter of majority opinion rather than inward appropriation. The crowd is untruth because it allows evasion of personal responsibility before God. Authenticity requires separation, becoming that single individual to whom his edifying discourses were addressed. Lostness is the soil of growth because it forces the labour of self-relation. Without it, we remain functions of our environment, echoes of public opinion, slaves to fashion or ideology. This confrontation opens two paths: deeper despair, refusing the task, willing not to be a self, or faith, accepting the task without a complete map. The leap of faith is terrifying precisely because it abandons the crowd's scaffolding. It is a leap into paradox, believing the absurd, that the eternal entered time in Christ, for example, not despite reason, but in passionate tension with it. Faith is not a once-and-for-all event, but a repeated movement, sustained by inward passion against the outward silence of the director. Kierkegaard's critique extends to modern society. In an era of mass media, bureaucracy, and speculative philosophy, which he saw as Hegelian system building that swallows the individual, the temptation to hide in the crowd grows stronger. Yet the anxiety of existence persists, erupting in moments of crisis. True Christianity for him is not the comfortable institution of Christendom, but the strenuous imitation of Christ, the knight of faith who lives in absolute relation to the absolute, embracing offence and absurdity. 5. Further dimensions: paradox, repetition, and the physician of the soul. Kierkegaard deepens these themes through paradox, a category central to his thought. The director's invisibility creates an objective uncertainty that faith must embrace subjectively. In Fear and Trembling, Abraham's silence, unable to explain his action ethically, embodies the isolation of the religious individual. The paradox of the incarnation, God in time, offends reason yet invites the leap. Repetition, another key concept, counters despair. The self must repeatedly choose itself, renewing the relation daily rather than seeking a final, static resolution. As a physician of the soul, Kierkegaard diagnoses modernity's spiritual ailments. The unconsulted self, thrown into a world of increasing levelling and abstraction, risks total despair by forgetting its eternal vocation. His remedy is not systematic philosophy, but indirect communication, pseudonyms, irony, and edification that provokes the reader into personal appropriation. The questions in the original passage are not problems to solve rationally, but wounds to inhabit passionately. Conclusion: inhabiting the wound. An invitation to authentic selfhood. Kierkegaard offers no tidy answer to, "Why was I not consulted?" because no imminent worldly answer suffices. The question is not a puzzle for speculation, but a perpetual wound that reminds us of our dependence on the transcendent. Every philosophy or ideology that erases the scandal, by reducing existence to biology, rational progress, historical determinism, or collective identity, misses the essence of being human. The unconsulted condition is permanent, What varies is our response. In the end, the inquiry is no mere complaint but a profound invitation. To ask, "Who am I?" amid the vertigo is already to enact the relation that relates itself to itself. That daily, anxious, passionate act of self-relation, choosing to show up for the unrehearsed drama, even when the director remains hidden, is the only authentic reply to a world that granted us no voice in our arrival. It leads not to comfortable certainty, but to a life of intensified existence, fearful yet trembling with possibility, despairing yet open to grace, lost yet on the path to becoming the single individual God calls forth. In inhabiting this tension, we do not overcome the unconsulted self. We become it fully in freedom and faith. This expanded exploration reveals Kierkegaard not as a gloomy pessimist, but as a diagnostician whose diagnosis liberates. By refusing easy consolations, he points us towards the strenuous joy of becoming spirit, relating ourselves to ourselves before the silent yet ever-present director. The vertigo remains, but so does the possibility of a leap that transforms anxiety into the highest passion of existence.